At 6:30 on a cold August morning in 1943, the fog over RAF Chelveston clung low to the ground, muffling the sound of engines beginning to stir. Crewmen moved through the grey light like shadows, tightening straps, checking ammunition, touching the metal skin of the aircraft as if it could answer back. In that stillness, Colonel Curtis LeMay stood on the flight line, watching 146 B-17 Flying Fortresses prepare for a mission that might redefine the meaning of American air power itself. No one said it aloud, but every man on that field understood the question hanging in the air. Was daylight precision bombing the brilliant weapon its architects promised, or a fatal illusion paid for in the lives of young airmen? Germany lay hundreds of miles ahead, defended by experienced pilots who had spent years perfecting the art of destroying bombers. The men preparing to fly into that storm knew the statistics. They knew how many bunks in the barracks now sat empty. And yet, they climbed aboard anyway. Before the engines roared and the formation lifted into the rising sun, one truth lingered. History was about to decide the fate of a doctrine, and the cost would be measured in blood. They had not reached this moment by accident. The path to August 1943 began years earlier, in the opening months of the war, when the Royal Air Force tried to strike Germany in broad daylight. Their Wellington bombers flew in proud, orderly formations, believing discipline and courage could overcome enemy defenses. But the truth arrived in the form of burning aircraft falling into the North Sea. On the 14th of December, 1939, half of the British force was shot down. 4 days later, nearly the same number vanished again. The lesson carved into the sky was unmistakable. Daylight bombing without escort fighters was suicide, so Britain turned to the night, to darkness that hid aircraft from German guns but shrouded targets as well. Crews learned to navigate by stars, dead reckoning, or the faint glow of burning cities. The goal was no longer precision but devastation. Under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, Bomber Command embraced area bombing, accepting that if a factory could not be hit, then the city around it would burn. Hamburg, Cologne, and the Ruhr became symbols not just of German industry but of its suffering, yet the results were undeniable. German resources shifted inward. Workers dug shelters instead of building tanks. Anti-aircraft guns stayed in cities instead of at the front. The night offered survival, and survival allowed continuous pressure. Across the Atlantic, American thinkers were crafting a different vision entirely. At the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama, officers like Hansel, Walker, and George argued that modern war was not won by destroying cities, but by severing the economic arteries that fed the enemy war machine. Ball bearings, aircraft plants, synthetic oil, transportation hubs, these were the critical nodes. Hit them with precision, they said, and you could paralyze an entire nation. And so the doctrine of daylight precision bombing was born. But there was a catch. It required bombers that could fly high, fly far, and defend themselves without escorts. The B-17 was built for that purpose, bristling with 50 caliber guns, armored against cannon fire, and designed to fly in tight combat box formations, where overlapping arcs of fire created a moving fortress. American air leaders believed this was enough, believed that courage, training, and technology could overcome what had destroyed British bombers in 1940. Yet by 1943, evidence was accumulating that belief alone could not keep men alive. The 8th Air Force had already lost more than 200 heavy bombers in 3 months. Crews spoke quietly about probability, about tours they doubted they would finish, about friends whose bunks sat empty. They knew the math. They knew the sky could not be reasoned with. Still, American commanders held to the doctrine, not simply because they believed in it, but because abandoning it meant conceding that strategic air power, the heart of their identity, had been built on a flawed foundation. Precision bombing had to work, it had to prove itself, and the coming raids would test whether theory could survive its first true trial by fire. Dawn broke hard and bright on the 17th of August 1943, as the first waves of B-17 seconds climbed into the thin air over the Channel. Below them, England receded into a muted patchwork of fields. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of occupied Europe, a corridor of danger with no fighter escort to shield them. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission was more than an operation. It was a test of everything American air power claimed to be. The plan was ambitious. One force would strike the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg, then continue south to North Africa. A second would hit the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt, targets so vital that analysts believed destroying them might choke German industry at its source. In theory, staggered timing would split the Luftwaffe response. In practice, weather delays meant both bomber streams entered the same gauntlet within an hour of each other. German radar stations tracked them from the coast. Fighter controllers vectored squadrons into position. The first attacks came over Belgium, slicing into the formation from above and below. Then came the head-on assaults, the most feared tactic of all. Fighters close to firing range at a combined speed of more than 500 miles per hour. From 800 yards out, beyond the reach of 50 caliber guns, they fired bursts of 20 and 30 millimeters cannon shells straight into the noses of the oncoming bombers. A single hit could kill both pilots before the aircraft even began to fall. The formations fought to hold together because separation meant death. A bomber that slipped out of alignment became a straggler, a solitary machine against an enemy that knew how to dismantle the weak. Veteran German asses claimed kill after kill. Among them was Colonel Heinz Bahr, who had mastered the art of the head-on strike. On that day alone, he downed multiple B-17 seconds, some consumed by fire, others breaking apart before crews could bail out. For the men inside the bombers, the hours stretched into something beyond time. Oxygen masks froze to their faces. Heated suits shorted under the cold. Flak blossomed in black flowers around them, while fighters attacked in waves. Yet they pressed on, flying straight and level during the bomb run because precision demanded it. When the surviving aircraft returned to England, the cost was staggering. 60 flying fortresses had been shot down. Nearly 600 men were dead, missing, or captured. But the targets had been hit. Regensburg's factories burned. Schweinfurt's production fell by a third. Analysts said the raid validated the doctrine. The crews who had survived wondered how many more such validations they could endure. The Luftwaffe wondered too, but for different reasons. They had discovered that the bombers were most vulnerable in the long hours before escort fighters arrived, and now they would adapt, concentrating every available unit into overwhelming, coordinated attacks. The next battles would be even bloodier. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid had proven one thing with brutal clarity. Daylight precision bombing could hurt Germany, perhaps even strategically. But it also exposed a truth the doctrine's architects had tried not to confront. Without escort fighters, the cost would always be catastrophic, and the Luftwaffe, far from being broken, was learning faster than the Americans expected. By September 1943, German Fighter Command had refined a system as lethal as it was efficient. Radar networks tracked incoming bomber streams hours before they reached their targets. Controllers massed fighters from France, Norway, and the interior, gathering them into formations, sometimes numbering over 100 aircraft. The attacks came in waves. The first tore gaps in the combat boxes. The second hunted stragglers. The third finished off the wounded. It was a rhythm of destruction, perfected through years of war. Losses mounted. On October 8, a raid on Bremen cost 30 bombers. 2 days later, another 30 fell over Munster. And then came the 14th of October 1943, the day bomber crews would remember simply as Black Thursday. The target was Schweinfurt again. Intelligence claimed the ball-bearing factories had recovered from the August strike, that German industry depended on them still. So the 8th Air Force sent nearly 300 B-17 seconds into a sky already waiting for them. More than 300 German fighters converged. The battle began over Belgium and did not stop for hours. Flak tore through the formations. Fighters ripped into the bombers with head-on attacks, diving passes, and cannon strikes that shattered cockpits and engines. Inside the aircraft, the experience was unbearable to describe yet impossible to forget. Oxygen systems failed under the cold. Control cables snapped from shrapnel. Men fought to hold formation even as their wings burned. Some bombers exploded when fire reached the bomb bays. Others simply broke apart in midair. Parachutes drifted like small white flags over enemy territory. 60 bombers were shot down. 17 more returned, so damaged they never flew again. More than 650 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire groups were gutted. Some units lost a third of their aircraft in a single day. And Schweinfurt? Its production fell only modestly. The Germans had dispersed facilities, stockpiled components, and secured foreign supplies. American losses were unsustainable. No amount of determination or doctrine could change the arithmetic. At a 20% loss rate, a bomber crew could expect to survive only a handful of missions. Deep penetration raids were suspended. The industrial heartland that mattered most became unreachable. In the silence afterward, commanders faced a bitter question. Had the British been right all along? Was daylight precision bombing a noble theory that reality refused to accept? Some believed so. Others refused to surrender the idea, insisting that daylight bombing could still work if the missing piece of the puzzle finally arrived. long-range escort fighters. The doctrine itself hung in the balance, suspended between conviction and collapse. Even as the wreckage of Black Thursday was counted, the debate that had shadowed the Allied air campaign since the beginning returned with renewed force. Around conference tables in London and Washington, the question resurfaced. Was daylight precision bombing a bold strategic necessity, or a costly refusal to acknowledge what Britain had already learned in blood? For British commanders, the answer seemed obvious. They had abandoned daylight raids in 1940 because survival demanded it. Night operations allowed continuous pressure with far fewer losses, and the results were visible in the devastation across Hamburg, Cologne, and the Ruhr. British leaders argued that if the objective was to break German industry and morale, their method was already doing so with increasingly destructive efficiency. But for the United States, the issue reached beyond tactics. Precision bombing was not merely a tool, it was the foundation of American air power doctrine, the justification for creating an independent air force. To abandon daylight operations was to admit that the core principle of American strategy had been flawed. General Henry Arnold knew that if the doctrine failed, the political vision he had fought for would fail with it. What kept the argument alive was the belief that technology could solve what courage alone could not. Long-range escort fighters had been promised at Casablanca. Now they were finally materializing. Engineers accelerated drop tank production for P-47 seconds. P-38 units worked to improve high-altitude performance. And then came the P-51 Mustang, its Merlin engine carrying it deep into German airspace with speed and maneuverability no Luftwaffe fighter could ignore. In early 1944, under the command of General James Doolittle, a new philosophy took hold. Escort fighters would no longer stay tied to the bomber formations. They would hunt, they would sweep ahead of the bombers, clearing the sky, dismantling the Luftwaffe fighter force piece by piece. For the first time, American air strategy shifted from merely surviving the German defense to destroying it. The effect was immediate. Fighter kill ratios climbed. German pilot losses became irrecoverable. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe still possessed aircraft, but lacked the trained pilots and fuel to use them effectively. When Allied bombers crossed into Germany, they no longer entered a sky owned by their enemy. Across the world, observers saw what this shift meant. A year earlier, daylight precision bombing seemed destined to collapse. Now, combined with British night attacks, it had become part of a relentless, around-the-clock campaign that was grinding the German war machine toward exhaustion. The strategy that once appeared doomed had found its missing element, and with it, the balance of the air war changed forever. When the war finally ended and the skies over Europe fell quiet, the great debate that had shaped the air campaign did not disappear. It merely shifted from briefing rooms and cockpit intercoms to the reflections of historians, veterans, and families who had borne the cost. What daylight precision bombing achieved and what it demanded remain intertwined in a legacy neither triumph nor tragedy alone can explain. For men like Ira Eker, the vindication came quietly. He had fought to preserve daylight operations at Casablanca, insisting that with time and the right tools, the strategy would work. Yet by the time long-range escorts arrived and the tide turned, he had been reassigned. History rarely rewards those who lay foundations they do not live to stand upon. Still, he believed the results proved his convictions. And perhaps they did. Curtis LeMay carried different lessons. The brutality of 1943 taught him that wars are not won by half measures. His later command of Strategic Air Command reflected that belief. If a nation commits to war, it must commit fully. Supporters called him decisive. Critics called him merciless. Both views were shaped by the shadows of burning B-17 seconds over Germany. James Doolittle, whose leadership helped break the Luftwaffe's grip on the skies, defended daylight precision bombing long after the war ended. He acknowledged the losses but insisted the strategy shortened the conflict and dismantled the industrial backbone that sustained Germany's armies. Henry Arnold lived just long enough to see his vision realized when the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, a testament to a doctrine tested in fire. Yet the true legacy belongs to the crews whose names are carved into stone at places like the Cambridge American Cemetery. They were the ones who climbed into cold aluminum aircraft, knowing the statistics, knowing the odds, knowing that the path to victory ran straight through their own mortality. Many never returned. Others came home quietly, built lives, raised families, and carried memories they rarely spoke aloud. Their sacrifice gave meaning to a strategy that might otherwise have remained only a theory. They proved that daylight precision bombing could work, but only when matched with the right tools, the right tactics, and a willingness to confront its human cost. The smoke of that era has long since faded, but its lessons remain, and so does a question we still ask today. When a nation chooses a path in war, how do we measure the price of being right? Thank you for watching, and for keeping these stories alive. Their echoes shape the world we inherit.